The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport when Dorothy Williams stepped out of the taxi. At 82 years old, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite its challenges. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore her best navy blue dress, the one she saved for special occasions. Today was definitely special. Dorothy had been planning this trip for over a year. Her great-granddaughter was graduating from West Point Military Academy, and nothing in the world could have kept her away from that ceremony. She had worked extra shifts at the church bake sale, saved every penny she could, and even sold some of her late husband's old tools to afford this first-class ticket to Los Angeles. It wasn't about luxury for her. It was about dignity and comfort for her aging bones during the long flight. The airport was buzzing with its usual morning rush. Business travelers hurried past with their rolling suitcases, families juggled children and luggage, and the constant announcements echoed through the terminals. Dorothy took her time, using her wooden cane to steady herself as she made her way through the crowds. Several kind strangers offered to help her with directions, and she smiled warmly at each one, her heart full of gratitude for small kindnesses. At security, the TSA agent noticed the small military pin on Dorothy's lapel, a simple bronze star that most people overlooked. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," the young man said respectfully. Dorothy nodded with a gentle smile, though she rarely talked about her time as a nurse in Korea. Those memories were both precious and painful, filled with faces of young soldiers she had helped heal, and some she couldn't save. After clearing security, Dorothy found a quiet corner near her gate and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was a photograph that had traveled with her everywhere for the past 15 years. It showed her late husband, Thomas, in his army dress uniform, standing proud and tall. Next to him was their son, Robert, also in military dress. Both men had served their country with honor, and both had passed away too soon. Now their legacy lived on in Dorothy's great-granddaughter, who was about to become the first woman in their family to graduate from West Point. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers. "We now invite our first-class passengers and those needing extra assistance to board Flight 447 to Los Angeles." Dorothy carefully gathered her things, a small purse, a light sweater, and a carry-on bag that contained gifts for the graduation ceremony. She had packed carefully, including a special photo album filled with family military history to present to her great-granddaughter. As she approached the gate, Dorothy handed her boarding pass to the airline employee. The young woman's eyes widened slightly when she saw the first-class designation. "Seat 12A, ma'am, that's right up front. Have a wonderful flight." Dorothy thanked her and began the slow walk down the jet bridge, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the carpeted floor. The flight attendants at the aircraft door greeted passengers with practiced smiles. "Welcome aboard," one of them said to Dorothy, though her smile seemed to falter slightly as she noticed Dorothy's first-class boarding pass. Dorothy didn't catch the quick exchange of glances between the crew members as she passed. Inside the aircraft, Dorothy was amazed by the spaciousness of the first-class cabin. The seats were wide and comfortable, with plenty of legroom, such a contrast to the cramped coach seats she was used to on her rare flights. She found row 12 and slowly made her way to seat A by the window. A businessman in an expensive suit was already seated in 12B, and he immediately stood up to help her. "Here, let me help you with that bag," he offered kindly, lifting her carry-on into the overhead compartment. "Flying somewhere special today?" Dorothy's face lit up as she began to tell him about her great-granddaughter's graduation. The man listened with genuine interest, sharing that his own daughter was in college studying engineering. As Dorothy settled into her seat, she marveled at all the amenities. There was a small pillow, a soft blanket, and even a little bag with toiletries. She had never experienced such comfort on a flight before. Through the window, she could see the ground crew preparing the aircraft, and her heart filled with anticipation for the journey ahead. She pulled out her phone, a simple model that her granddaughter had taught her to use, and carefully took a photo of her boarding pass and seat. She wanted to remember this moment and share it with her family. This was more than just a flight. It was a celebration of how far their family had come. Other first-class passengers continued boarding around her. There was an elderly white gentleman, who nodded politely, a middle-aged woman who was already buried in her laptop, and a young couple who seemed to be on their honeymoon. Everyone appeared comfortable and settled, the typical mix of business travelers and people celebrating special occasions. Dorothy opened her purse and pulled out the photograph of her husband again. "Thomas," she whispered quietly, "I wish you could see this. Our little Angela is going to be an officer in the United States Army." She traced his face in the photo with her finger, remembering how proud he had been of their family's military tradition. A flight attendant appeared with a warm towel and a glass of water. "Can I get you anything else before takeoff, ma'am?" she asked politely. Dorothy smiled and shook her head, feeling grateful for the attentive service. Everything seemed perfect for what was supposed to be the most important trip of her life. As she adjusted her seatbelt and prepared for departure, Dorothy felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had worked hard for this moment, saved every dollar, and overcome her fear of flying alone at her age. The ticket in her hand represented more than just transportation. It was proof that she could still make important things happen, that she was still an active part of her family's story. The cabin was filling up now, with the sounds of passengers settling in, overhead bins closing, and the gentle hum of the aircraft systems coming to life. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment and said a small prayer of gratitude for the opportunity to witness her great-granddaughter's achievement. Little did she know that her peaceful journey was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test not only her own dignity but also reveal the true character of those around her. For now, though, she simply sat in her rightfully purchased seat, a proud military family matriarch heading to celebrate the next generation's success, completely unaware of the confrontation that awaited her just minutes away. Dorothy had just finished arranging her small belongings in the seat pocket when she noticed a flight attendant walking purposefully down the aisle toward her row. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a name tag that read Jessica. Her expression was stern, and she carried herself with an air of authority that seemed unusually intense for the normally friendly cabin crew Dorothy had encountered. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica said, stopping directly beside Dorothy's seat. Her voice was loud enough that several nearby passengers looked up from their phones and magazines. "I need to see your boarding pass again." Dorothy looked up with surprise, her weathered hands reaching for her purse. "Of course, dear," she said politely, though confusion was evident in her voice. She had already shown her boarding pass to multiple people, at the gate, when entering the aircraft, and even to the helpful businessman who had assisted her with her luggage. With careful movements, Dorothy retrieved her boarding pass from the small compartment in her wallet where she kept it safe. The paper was slightly worn from handling, but the printing was clear. Seat 12A, first class. She handed it to Jessica with a gentle smile, expecting this to be a simple routine check. Jessica examined the boarding pass with unusual scrutiny, turning it over in her hands and holding it up to the light as if looking for signs of forgery. The businessman in seat 12B watched this interaction with growing concern, his eyebrows furrowing as he observed Jessica's behavior. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of mistake here," Jessica announced, her voice carrying across the first-class cabin. Several passengers turned to look, including the elderly gentleman across the aisle and the young couple a few rows back. "This can't be right. You're going to need to gather your things and move to coach." Dorothy's heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. That's my seat. I paid for it." "Look, I don't know how this happened," Jessica continued, her tone becoming increasingly aggressive. "But there's obviously been some error with your ticket. Someone like you doesn't just end up in first class. The computer system must have made a mistake when you checked in." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. "Someone like me?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. She had heard those words before, decades ago, in a different time and place, but she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that such attitudes had faded away. "I saved for months to buy this ticket," Dorothy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have my receipt, my confirmation number. This is my seat." She began fumbling through her purse looking for the additional documentation she had carefully organized before the trip. But Jessica wasn't interested in seeing more paperwork. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to be reasonable here. Coach seats are perfectly fine. There are plenty of empty seats back there where you'll be more comfortable. This is probably just a mix-up with someone's charity ticket or something." The businessman in 12B couldn't stay silent any longer. "Excuse me," he interjected, "but this lady has been sitting here since boarding began. She clearly has the right ticket for this seat." His voice was firm, but respectful, though there was an edge of irritation creeping in. "Sir, I need you to stay out of this," Jessica snapped at him. "This is between me and her. I know how to do my job." She turned back to Dorothy, who was now visibly shaking. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Please gather your belongings and move to the rear of the aircraft. We need to prepare for departure." Dorothy felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she fought them back. She had not survived the Korean War, raised a family through the civil rights era, and worked for 40 years in a veterans hospital to be intimidated now. "Young lady," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I bought this ticket with my own money. I have every right to be here." "Don't make this difficult," Jessica warned, her voice rising. "Security can be called if necessary. I'm sure you don't want that kind of embarrassment." By now, most of the first-class cabin was watching the confrontation unfold. Passengers were whispering to each other, some pulling out their phones. The woman with the laptop had stopped working entirely and was staring in disbelief. The young couple looked shocked, and the bride-to-be was nudging her fiancé to do something. A middle-aged man in row 10 stood up partially. "This is completely inappropriate," he called out. "That woman has done nothing wrong. She's been sitting there peacefully this whole time." "Everyone please mind your own business," Jessica shot back, clearly flustered by the growing audience. This is a routine seating issue that happens all the time, but it wasn't routine and everyone in the cabin knew it. The way Jessica was treating Dorothy was unlike anything they had witnessed on previous flights. Her tone, her assumptions, her refusal to accept valid documentation, it all painted a disturbing picture. Dorothy's hands were shaking now as she clutched her boarding pass. She thought about her great-granddaughter, waiting at West Point for her arrival. She thought about her late husband Thomas, who had faced discrimination in the Army, but had persevered with dignity. She thought about all the young soldiers she had cared for in Korea, regardless of their race or background, because that's what service meant. "I am not moving," Dorothy said quietly, but with unmistakable determination. "This is my seat, and I paid for it fair and square." Jessica's face reddened with anger. "Fine. If you want to do this the hard way, we can do this the hard way." She reached for her radio, preparing to call for backup. The businessman in 12B had heard enough. He pulled out his smartphone and began recording. "I'm documenting this entire interaction," he announced loudly. "This woman has a valid boarding pass for this seat and she's being harassed for no legitimate reason." "You cannot record me without permission," Jessica snapped, trying to block his phone with her hand. "Actually, I can," he replied calmly. "This is a public space, and this behavior needs to be documented." Other passengers began pulling out their phones as well. The young woman across the aisle started recording, as did the man in row 10. Jessica looked around frantically, realizing that her behavior was being captured from multiple angles. The elderly gentleman across the aisle finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Young lady, I've been flying for over 50 years and I have never seen such unprofessional behavior from airline staff. This woman has every right to be here, and you have no right to treat her this way." Dorothy felt a warmth spread through her chest as she realized that strangers were standing up for her. It reminded her of the better moments in her life, when people chose to do what was right rather than what was easy. But Jessica wasn't backing down. She was too deep in the confrontation now, her pride and authority on the line in front of a cabin full of witnesses. "I don't care what any of you think," she declared. "I'm in charge of this cabin and I'm telling her to move." The commotion was now loud enough to be heard throughout the aircraft. Passengers in coach were craning their necks to see what was happening, and word was spreading quickly through the plane that something serious was occurring in first class. unknown to everyone involved in the confrontation. The captain had been notified by another crew member about the disturbance. He was already making his way toward the first-class cabin, having heard enough over the aircraft's internal communication system to know that immediate intervention was necessary. Dorothy sat in her seat, surrounded by strangers who had become her unexpected defenders, holding tight to her boarding pass and her dignity. She had no idea that her quiet stand for what was right was about to change not just her own day, but touch the hearts of everyone who witnessed what happened next. The noise from the first-class cabin had grown loud enough that passengers throughout the entire aircraft could sense something serious was happening. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes had been going through his pre-flight checklist when his co-pilot mentioned hearing raised voices from the cabin. At first, he assumed it was just the usual boarding chaos, but when his flight engineer looked concerned and mentioned it was getting worse, the captain decided to investigate. Captain Hayes was a 15-year veteran of commercial aviation, a man who had earned his position through skill, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to the safety and dignity of every passenger under his care. He had flown millions of miles, handled countless emergencies, and prided himself on running a professional operation. What he was about to witness would test every principle he held dear about leadership and doing what was right. As he emerged from the cockpit, the captain could immediately hear Jessica's raised voice echoing through the first-class cabin. He paused for a moment at the galley, observing the scene before him. What he saw made his jaw tighten with concern and growing anger. There was Dorothy, an elderly woman sitting calmly in seat 12A, clutching her boarding pass with trembling hands, while a flight attendant stood over her in an aggressive posture. Around them, passengers were holding up phones, recording what was clearly an uncomfortable confrontation. The captain could see the distress on Dorothy's face, the way she was trying to maintain her composure despite being publicly humiliated. "What exactly is going on here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the cabin. Jessica spun around, clearly startled to see the captain outside the cockpit. "Captain Hayes," she said, trying to regain her composure and sound professional. "I'm just handling a seating issue. This passenger seems to have the wrong ticket and I'm trying to relocate her to her proper seat in coach." The captain looked at Dorothy, then back at Jessica. "Show me the boarding pass," he said simply. Jessica hesitated for a moment, then handed him Dorothy's boarding pass. Captain Hayes examined it carefully, checking the seat number, the class designation, and the flight information. Everything was completely legitimate and in order. "This boarding pass is valid for seat 12A, he stated, clearly loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "What seems to be the problem?" "Well, I just thought there might be some mistake," Jessica stammered, realizing that her captain was not supporting her position. "Someone like her usually doesn't fly first class, so I assumed there was an error in the system." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Captain Hayes felt his blood pressure rising, but he maintained his professional demeanor. He had heard those words before, and they represented everything he despised about prejudice and discrimination. "Someone like her?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. The entire first-class cabin fell silent, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Dorothy looked up at the captain, her eyes filled with decades of pain from hearing similar comments throughout her life. She had endured discrimination in the military, in her workplace, and in countless everyday situations. But something about this moment felt different. This time, she wasn't alone. The businessman in seat 12B leaned forward. "Captain, I've been recording this entire interaction. This lady has been treated terribly for no reason other than—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. Captain Hayes nodded to the passenger, then knelt down beside Dorothy's seat so he could speak to her at eye level. His voice was gentle and respectful. "Ma'am, I apologize for this completely inappropriate treatment. You have every right to be in this seat, and you will not be moved." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since the confrontation began, they were tears of relief rather than frustration. "Thank you," she whispered. As the captain stood up, he noticed something that made him pause. There was a small pin on Dorothy's dress lapel, partially hidden by her sweater. It was a military service pin, worn and tarnished with age. Hanging from her purse was a ribbon that looked familiar to his trained eye. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I notice you have a service pin. Were you in the military?" Dorothy's hand instinctively went to the pin on her lapel. "Yes, sir. I was a nurse in Korea many years ago." The captain's expression immediately changed to one of deep respect. "Korea?" he asked. "What unit?" "The 8055th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital," Dorothy replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her service. "I was there from 1952 to 1953. A murmur went through the first-class cabin as passengers realized they were in the presence of a veteran. The businessman in 12B looked amazed, and several other passengers leaned forward to listen. Captain Hayes himself had served in the Air Force before becoming a commercial pilot, and he understood the sacrifice and courage it took to serve in Korea, especially for a young woman in the 1950s. The 8055th MASH unit was legendary for its life-saving work, under incredibly difficult conditions. "How old were you when you served?" he asked. 22 when I arrived in Korea," Dorothy said, her voice now filled with pride rather than fear. "I was one of only a few black nurses in our unit. It wasn't easy, but we had jobs to do, soldiers to save." The elderly gentleman across the aisle spoke up. "I was in Korea too, ma'am. Army infantry. I probably owe my life to nurses like you." Dorothy turned to look at him, and their eyes met with the understanding that only veterans share. "We all did our part," she said simply. Captain Hayes stood up straighter, his military training evident in his posture. "Ma'am, it is an honor to have you on my aircraft. Your service to this country deserves nothing but respect and gratitude." He turned to Jessica, and his expression was no longer gentle. "You will return to the galley immediately. We will discuss your behavior after this flight lands." Jessica's face went pale as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had not only discriminated against an elderly passenger, but she had disrespected a veteran who had served her country with honor. "But Captain, I was just trying to—" she began to protest. "There is no excuse for what I witnessed here," Captain Hayes cut her off. "Return to the galley. Now." As Jessica walked away in shame, the captain addressed the entire first-class cabin over the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have the privilege of flying with a Korean War veteran today. This remarkable woman served as a nurse with the 8055th MASH unit, saving the lives of countless soldiers under extremely difficult conditions." Spontaneous applause broke out throughout the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been strangers moments before were now united in showing respect for Dorothy's service. The businessman next to her started clapping, the elderly veteran across the aisle saluted, and even passengers from coach who could hear the announcement began applauding. Dorothy was overwhelmed by the response. She had rarely talked about her military service, partly because of the discrimination she had faced both during and after her time in Korea. But now, surrounded by strangers who were honoring her sacrifice, she felt a pride she hadn't experienced in years. "Ma'am," Captain Hayes said, returning to kneel beside her seat, "is there anything I can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable? Where are you traveling today?" Dorothy's face lit up with joy as she thought about her destination. "I'm going to Los Angeles for my great-granddaughter's graduation from West Point. She's going to be an officer in the Army, just like her great-grandfather was." The captain smiled widely. "Military families are special families. Your great-granddaughter is lucky to have such a strong example to follow." As Captain Hayes prepared to return to the cockpit, he made a decision that would turn this difficult situation into something beautiful. He had an idea that would not only restore Dorothy's dignity, but also show everyone on the plane what true respect and honor looked like. The transformation in the cabin was remarkable. What had begun as an ugly confrontation was becoming a celebration of service, sacrifice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Dorothy sat in her rightful seat, no longer alone or afraid, surrounded by fellow passengers who now saw her not as someone to be moved but as someone to be honored. Captain Hayes remained beside Dorothy's seat, genuinely curious about her story. Something about her quiet dignity and the way she carried herself told him there was much more to learn about this remarkable woman. The military pin on her lapel was just the beginning. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking," the captain said gently, "what was it like serving as a nurse in Korea? That must have been incredibly challenging, especially for a young woman." Dorothy's eyes took on a distant look as memories from 7 decades ago came flooding back. "It was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life," she said quietly. "We worked 18-hour days sometimes trying to save boys who were barely older than children. The conditions were terrible, muddy, cold, and we never had enough supplies." The businessman in seat 12B had put away his phone and was listening intently. Across the aisle, the elderly veteran who had also served in Korea was nodding with understanding. Other passengers had turned in their seats to hear Dorothy's story. "I remember one night," Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "We had so many wounded soldiers coming in that we ran out of beds. We were putting men on stretchers on the floor anywhere we could find space. I hadn't slept in 36 hours, but there was this young soldier. Couldn't have been more than 19, and he was calling for his mother." She paused, her weathered hands clasping together in her lap. "I sat with him all night holding his hand, telling him stories about home until the doctors could get to him. He made it through surgery and eventually went home to his family. Years later, I got a letter from him. He'd become a teacher, got married, had children. He said he never forgot the nurse who stayed with him that night." Captain Hayes felt a lump forming in his throat. As a former military officer himself, he understood the weight of service and sacrifice. "That's what real heroism looks like," he said with deep respect. Dorothy shook her head modestly. "We all did what we had to do. The doctors, the other nurses, the soldiers themselves. Everyone was a hero in their own way. I just did my job." "How many nurses were in your unit?" asked the elderly veteran across the aisle. "About 25 at any given time," Dorothy replied. "Most of them were white girls from small towns who'd never seen anything like what we encountered in Korea. But you know what? When it came to saving lives, none of that other stuff mattered. We were all just Americans trying to help American soldiers." She reached into her purse and carefully pulled out a small, worn photograph. "This was taken at our unit in 1953, just before I came home." The photo showed a group of young nurses in military uniforms standing in front of a medical tent. Dorothy pointed to a young black woman in the back row. "That's me, age 23. Captain Hayes looked at the photograph with amazement. The young woman in the picture bore little resemblance to the elderly lady sitting before him, but her eyes held the same quiet strength and determination. "After Korea, what did you do?" he asked. Dorothy's face lit up with pride. "I came home and worked at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Atlanta for 40 years. I wanted to keep taking care of soldiers, you know? Many of the men I treated were Korea veterans. Some were from Vietnam and later from Desert Storm. It felt like I was still serving in my own way." She pulled out another photograph, this one more recent but still worn from handling. It showed Dorothy in her VA hospital uniform, surrounded by a group of veterans at what appeared to be a retirement party. 40 years at the VA?" the captain asked with amazement. "That's incredible dedication." "Those boys needed someone who understood," Dorothy said simply. "Someone who knew what they'd been through. I'd seen the worst of war, and I'd seen how strong the human spirit could be. I wanted to help them heal, not just their bodies, but their hearts too." The businessman beside her wiped his eyes with his napkin. "My grandfather was in Korea," he said softly. "He used to talk about nurses, like you, how they saved so many lives. He always said they were angels." Dorothy reached over and patted his hand gently. "We were just young women doing our best in impossible circumstances. But I'm glad we could make a difference." Captain Hayes noticed another detail he had missed before. Hanging from Dorothy's purse was a small ribbon with a distinctive pattern. "Ma'am, is that a Purple Heart ribbon?" Dorothy's expression grew solemn. It belonged to my husband Thomas. He served in Korea too in the Army infantry. He was wounded twice but survived the war. We met at a USO dance when we both got back to the States. She carefully detached the ribbon from her purse and held it in her palm. Thomas always said I deserved this medal more than he did, because I saw more wounded soldiers than he ever did. After he passed 15 years ago, I started carrying it with me. It reminds me of him and all the brave men we served with. The elderly veteran across the aisle stood up slowly and came over to Dorothy's row. "Ma'am, may I shake your hand? As one Korea veteran to another, thank you for your service. People like you and your husband are the reason some of us made it home." Dorothy stood up carefully and took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you for your service too, soldier. We all looked out for each other over there." Captain Hayes watched this exchange with deep emotion. He realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the meeting of two veterans, but a moment of healing and recognition that had been decades in the making. "Ma'am," the captain said, "you mentioned earlier that you're traveling to see your great-granddaughter graduate from West Point. Is she following in the family military tradition?" Dorothy's entire demeanor changed, her face glowing with pride and joy. "Oh yes, Angela is graduating this weekend and will be commissioned as a second lieutenant. She's the first woman in our family to attend West Point, but she's the third generation to serve in the Army." She pulled out her phone, the simple model her granddaughter had bought for her, and showed the captain a photo. It was a beautiful, young woman in a West Point cadet uniform, standing at attention with a bright smile. She's studying engineering and wants to help build bridges and roads in places where they're needed most. She says she wants to help rebuild communities the way her great-great-grandmother helped heal soldiers. The captain studied the photo with admiration. "She looks like a fine soldier. West Point produces excellent officers. Her great-grandfather Thomas would be so proud," Dorothy continued, her voice thick with emotion. "He always dreamed that one of his descendants would graduate from West Point. He used to say that education and service were the two most important things a person could pursue." Dorothy reached into her purse again and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a set of military medals, carefully preserved and polished. These were Thomas's. "I'm going to present them to Angela at her graduation ceremony. I want her to remember that she comes from a long line of people who served their country with honor." The entire first-class cabin had gone quiet as passengers listened to Dorothy's story. Many were wiping away tears, moved by this woman's lifetime of service and sacrifice. The young couple who had been on their honeymoon were holding hands and looking at Dorothy with obvious admiration. "Ma'am," Captain Hayes said, his voice filled with respect, "it has been an absolute honor to meet you and hear your story. Your family's legacy of service is exactly what makes America strong." Dorothy looked around at all the faces watching, her strangers who had become friends, people who now understood her worth and dignity. "Thank you all for listening to an old woman's stories. Sometimes it's good to remember that we're all in this together, no matter where we come from or what we look like." As Captain Hayes prepared to return to the cockpit to begin their departure, he realized that this flight was going to be unlike any other he had ever flown. Dorothy wasn't just a passenger. She was a living piece of American history, a woman whose service and sacrifice deserved to be honored in a way she would never forget. Captain Hayes stood quietly for a moment, looking at Dorothy with the respect that one service member shows another. But something was stirring in his mind, an idea that would transform this flight from a simple journey into a moment Dorothy would treasure for the rest of her life. He had the power to make something extraordinary happen, and he was determined to use it. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced over the cabin intercom, his voice carrying throughout the entire aircraft, "before we begin our departure, I want to share something important with all of you." Passengers throughout the plane stopped their conversations and turned their attention to the announcement. In coach, people put down their magazines and phones. Flight attendants paused in their pre-flight preparations. Even the ground crew outside seemed to sense that something special was happening. "We have a very distinguished passenger aboard our flight today," Captain Hayes continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Mrs. Dorothy Williams, seated in 12A, is a Korean War veteran who served as a nurse with the 8055th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital from 1952 to 1953. A hush fell over the entire aircraft. Many passengers had never met a Korean War veteran, and the reverence in the captain's voice made them understand they were in the presence of someone truly special. For those who may not know, the captain continued, the Korean War nurses worked under incredibly dangerous conditions, often just miles from the front lines. They saved countless American lives under circumstances that most of us can't even imagine. These brave women worked around the clock in muddy, cold conditions with limited supplies, performing miracles of medicine and compassion. Dorothy felt tears welling up in her eyes. In all her years of service, both military and civilian, she had rarely received such public recognition. She had always been content to work quietly in the background, helping others without seeking acknowledgement. Mrs. Williams, the captain said, now speaking directly to her while the entire plane listened. After your military service, you continued serving your country for 40 years at the Veterans Administration Hospital, caring for soldiers from Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. Your lifetime of service represents the very best of American values. The applause started, slowly in first class but quickly spread throughout the entire aircraft. Passengers and coach were standing up, trying to see toward the front of the plane. Flight attendants were clapping, and even the co-pilot had stepped out of the cockpit to participate in the recognition. But Captain Hayes wasn't finished. He had one more surprise that would make this moment truly unforgettable. Mrs. Williams, he said, stepping directly in front of her seat, as a former Air Force officer myself, I want to show you the respect and honor you deserve. What happened next took Dorothy's breath away. Captain Hayes stood at perfect military attention, raised his right hand to his forehead and rendered a crisp, formal military salute. It was the salute of one service member honoring another, a gesture of respect that transcended rank, time, and circumstance. Dorothy gasped softly, her hands covering her heart. In all her years since leaving the Army, no one had ever saluted her. She had been so young when she served, and women in the military received so little recognition in those days that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be acknowledged as a soldier. Slowly, with tears streaming down her face, Dorothy struggled to stand up. Her arthritis made it difficult, but the businessman beside her immediately stood to help steady her. Once on her feet, Dorothy raised her own weathered hand and returned the salute with as much precision as her 82-year-old body could manage. The sight of these two veterans, one young and one old, one white and one black, one Air Force, and one Army, saluting each other with mutual respect brought the entire cabin to its feet. The applause was thunderous now, echoing throughout the aircraft and spilling out onto the tarmac where ground crew members stopped their work to watch through the windows. The elderly veteran who had also served in Korea was crying openly, remembering comrades who never made it home and honoring those who did. The businessman who had first defended Dorothy was applauding with tears in his eyes. The young couple on their honeymoon looked at each other with new understanding of what service and sacrifice really meant. Even passengers and coach who couldn't see what was happening were standing and clapping. Moved by the emotion in the captain's voice and the significance of the moment, children asked their parents what was happening, and parents struggled through their own tears to explain about heroes and service and honoring those who served. Dorothy held her salute for several seconds, looking directly into Captain Hayes's eyes. In that moment, she felt every year of service, every wounded soldier she had comforted, every veteran she had helped heal, every sacrifice she and Thomas had made for their country. She felt proud in a way she hadn't experienced since coming home from Korea 70 years ago. When they finally lowered their hands, Captain Hayes stepped forward and gently took Dorothy's hands in his. On behalf of the United States Air Force, the entire airline industry, and every American who has benefited from your service, thank you. It has been the greatest honor of my career to meet you. Thank you, Captain, Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. This means more to me than you could ever know. But the captain had one final gift for Dorothy. Mrs. Williams, when you return from your great-granddaughter's graduation, you'll be flying first class at no charge with the airline's compliments. It's the least we can do for someone who has given so much to her country. The applause erupted, again louder than before. Passengers were cheering now, calling out, "Thank you for your service and God bless you." Dorothy looked around the cabin at all these strangers who had become her champions, her heart overflowing with gratitude and joy. As Dorothy slowly sat back down, the businessman beside her shook her hand warmly. "Ma'am, it's been an honor to sit next to you. I'm going to tell my children about meeting you today." The elderly veteran from across the aisle came over once more. "Sister," he said, using the term Korean War veterans often used for each other, "I hope that granddaughter of yours knows what an amazing woman raised her family." "Great-granddaughter," Dorothy corrected with a smile, "and I think she does. She calls me her hero, but really she's mine. She's carrying on the family tradition in a way that makes all of us proud." As the captain prepared to return to the cockpit, he made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing for Los Angeles in just a few minutes. Mrs. Williams is traveling there to watch her great-granddaughter graduate from West Point Military Academy. I can't think of a better reason to fly, or a more deserving passenger to have aboard our aircraft." The applause continued as Captain Hayes walked back toward the cockpit, but he paused at Dorothy's seat one more time. "Ma'am, I hope your great-granddaughter's graduation is everything you've dreamed it would be. She's lucky to have you there." Dorothy nodded, clutching the small box of her late husband's medals. Thomas would have loved to see this day. In a way, I think he will be there with us. As the aircraft finally began to push back from the gate, Dorothy looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had boarded this plane as just another elderly passenger, had been treated with disrespect and discrimination, but was now surrounded by new friends who understood her worth. The young flight attendant who had caused all the trouble was nowhere to be seen, having been removed from the flight. In her place, other crew members approached Dorothy throughout the flight, bringing her extra pillows, offering her drinks, and simply thanking her for her service. As the plane climbed into the sky toward Los Angeles, Dorothy closed her eyes and said a prayer of gratitude. She thought about Angela, waiting for her at West Point, and about the ceremony where she would present her great-granddaughter with Thomas's medals. She thought about the long line of service in her family, and how proud she was to be part of that legacy. When Dorothy opened her eyes, she saw that several passengers were still looking at her with admiration and respect. She smiled back at them, feeling truly honored and appreciated for perhaps the first time in her life. This flight had become so much more than transportation. It had become a celebration of service, dignity, and the power of doing what's right. The airplane carried them all toward their destinations, but for Dorothy, the most important part of her journey had already happened. She had been reminded that she was not just an elderly woman traveling alone, but a hero whose service and sacrifice mattered, whose story deserved to be told, and whose dignity could never be taken away by anyone.